For the News and Observer, I'm Dawn Vaughan, Capitol Bureau Chief and host of Under the Dome, and you're listening to our latest episode for the week of October 9th, 2023. Today, I'm joined by my politics team colleague, Kyle Ingram, and investigative reporter, Tyler Dukes. We have Tyler here today because he's also a key data expert and knows a lot about redistricting and gerrymandering, which is on a lot of people's minds as we get into October and the legislative session is not done yet. There was at one point, if the budget was actually going to be done on schedule, that the lawmakers were going to take a break for a month or a couple months and then come back in the fall. But that didn't really happen, and it's fall, and here we are on this map time. So it doesn't look like, as you're listening to this, that there'll be any maps coming out this week, maybe toward the end of the week. House Speaker Moore told reporters recently, but there's map work going on. It's just nothing that we're really seeing. So before we get to how the process is different this year, Tyler, how did we get here?
Well, it's been a long road. And for those people who sort of follow redistricting, might not be terribly surprised that we're here again. But to put a finer point on this, I mean, redistricting is supposed to be a process that only happens once every 10 years. But for decades, it has not been that way in North Carolina. This has been a constant fight between Republicans and Democrats and even other types of groups who have challenged these maps continually over the last couple decades on lots of different grounds. And what we're seeing at this point is the result of what in effect is sort of a established rule that neither the federal nor the state Supreme Court in North Carolina is going to in any way weigh in on partisan gerrymandering.
So why is North Carolina so special?
Well, we're special for a bunch of different reasons. I mean, we are in some ways a state that is still very competitive. So when we think about the reason why groups want to come in and challenge these maps, sometimes they're getting money from groups who feel like that challenging that map is going to make a difference. But we're also a state that has, for a very long time, sort of entangled both partisan and racial considerations within the context of drawing these maps. And in fact, a lot of the Supreme Court precedent on redistricting in the entire United States is predicated upon the kinds of things that have happened here in North Carolina. We all remember when Democrats were in control, we saw these sort of spooky, snaky lines that would, go the entire length of I-85 in the western part of the state. This state very much has a legacy of what some would consider gerrymandering, and that has sort of gone from the spectrum of racial gerrymandering in some cases all the way up through what we're now really often talking about, which is partisan gerrymandering.
So, Kyle, you're our lead reporter on redistricting. As we had this, initially it was going to be a special session, but it's just kind of the end of the session. So what can people expect that's going to happen with how this comes together this year? And there were a couple public hearings, but that's it. And how is that going to be different than what happened last time, which was only, very recently?
Yeah, so they've had 3 public hearings on redistricting so far across the state. The last one was in Raleigh, and I attended that one. It went on for a very long time, and the overwhelming consensus was people coming in saying, we don't want our maps gerrymandered, we want this to be done as fairly as possible. And you also heard a lot of people calling for an independent redistricting committee, which is something that a small number of states currently do have, and it's hard to remove politics from a political process, but there are some states that do make an effort to do that. But what you saw in the last 2 redistricting sessions was the first one, the courts actually ordered more transparency. So they had to have these public map drawing sessions where people could see it happening in real time. And then they carried that over into the next redistricting session. But those were really anomalies. Before that, it really is mostly that the maps were drawn in private, and it looks like they're going back to that this time. So I think what we can most likely expect this time is that the maps will come to us fully formed. We won't see what went into that. And, there was a section of the existing law saying that once new maps are approved, you can, all of the drafting and the communications that went into creating those became public record. That was completely cleanly repealed in the new budget. So we won't be able to see anything that went into making the maps.
When was, like, I guess, how opaque was it before this last few rounds? Was it pretty behind closed doors regardless of records, or was there a way for that to come out even if it was later, or that came out in court?
A lot of times this stuff would come out court. The process was very opaque prior to the last couple of years, and to the legislature's credit, they did a lot of things to make this process much more open. Now, there were still plenty of complaints about that. There were still plenty of accusations that there was map work going on behind the scenes. But really the last couple of years saw pretty remarkable transparency compared to previous years. And even the public records provisions, which me and some of my colleagues have actually tested in recent years, often don't give you a ton of insight into the back and forth between lawmakers and often other groups that are helping influence the map making process through their own analysis. And so what we would actually see is really the insight we got into how some of these maps were created were often coming out through the discovery process and some of the many, many, many lawsuits being filed over legislative and congressional maps.
So we're not lawyers, obviously. I guess some lawyers become journalists. I don't know why, but so would you say the maps right now before they're changed are fair? And if you have the majority party that's going to change them, they're pretty more likely to be unfair, gerrymandering?
Yeah, in terms of how fair the maps as they currently stand, I think there are some pretty good arguments that these are some of the most fair maps we've probably seen in recent years, largely because they are the result of some pretty in-depth analysis that has taken place in the courts that has forced the legislature's hand to make these maps sort of more, in some cases, more responsive to the public. In terms of how far is the legislature going to take this in terms of partisan skew, that's a big open question, because up until now there has at least been a concern at first on the federal level that the federal Supreme Court was going to rule on partisan gerrymandering. That didn't happen. Kicked back down to the state Supreme Court, which was up until this most recent term very interested in trying to put the kibosh on really, really extreme forms of partisan gerrymandering. That does not exist anymore. And because the North Carolina does not have an independent redistricting committee, also because there's no possibility of sort of voter referenda to form those kinds of committees, really the power broadly rests with this legislature. Now, the one check on that might be something like racial gerrymandering. The legislature still does have to conform with federal law and the Voting Rights Act. And so that is still a possible avenue that will perform a check on that. But, it's really going to be an open question about this.
That was that phrase, surgical precision, right, in court, that was used to describe the maps. So what did Democrats do when they ran the maps? A
lot of the same stuff. And this is sort of the argument for people on both sides of the legislature who, up until sort of COVID derailed this a bit, were really interested in trying to make this process better, more fair. Republicans and Democrats worked together on that in a failed bid to make that a little bit better. But yeah, absolutely, Democrats gerrymandered their own maps, both in Congress and the legislature. And again, that was the genesis of many of the Supreme Court cases that are now being brought to bear on the maps that the current legislature is drawing. And we should say, by the way, that this is not something limited to Republicans in North Carolina. Democrats in other states, Republicans in other states are also going through these redistricting processes. And, in fact, the federal case that went in front of the Supreme Court dealt with what Democrats were doing in Maryland and was argued at basically the same time as North Carolina's.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the logistics of what to expect next with redistricting coming up, what else is happening this week, and then our picks for headliner of the week, which there's been a lot of news lately. So we'll be right back. You're listening to Under the Dome. I'm Capitol Bureau Chief Dawn Vaughan, here with investigative reporter Tyler Dukes and politics reporter Kyle Ingram. Before the break, we were talking about redistricting and gerrymandering and how it seems like nobody's happy with whoever's in charge of it generally. So, Kyle, what are we looking at for how this is going to play out? What are the things that the unknowns, basically, of how this is going to come together throughout October.
I think one of the most interesting things we'll be looking at is how this affects North Carolina's congressional delegation. Our current congressional map was a court-ordered one that was created in 2022 by a group of special masters because the maps from the actual legislature were rejected. So that map resulted in a 7-7 split. So we have 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats from North Carolina in Congress. It's unlikely, I would say, that the legislature is going to draw a map that keeps that exact same breakdown. So it's going to be interesting to see how severe that ends up being. Is it 10-4, 9-5? We really don't know yet.
We have a lot of freshmen in Congress, right? So there's Chuck Edwards on the Republican side, and the Democratic side is Jeff Jackson, Don Davis, Wiley Nickel. There's somebody else I'm forgetting. I'm always like...
Is Kathy Manning a freshman?
No, she's not a freshman. Deborah Ross is incumbent on Adams. So I'm sorry, whoever we forgot. There's a lot of you to remember. But one district we'd probably be looking at is whatever, Kings Mountain includes, right? Because House Speaker Moore already says he's not running again. And
for the legislature, but
right, exactly, and that we know he was interested in Congress before, among other jobs. So whatever that district might look like, and if Republicans want to get rid of some Democrats that are vulnerable or who they don't particularly care for, Jeff Jackson, who is in the state Senate, is already floating that I'm going to wait and see what happens with the maps, and maybe he'll get in the race for the primary for Attorney General.
Well, he's already made one of his famous TikToks saying that he's going to be redistricted out of his seat. So.
Okay, well, I mean, I could see that just because of the pettiness of the legislature that somebody quips, well, you asked for it, or something like that. So, or that somebody gets redistricted into a tiny basement office district. So they have some rules, though, so I don't think we'll see quite that pan out. So anyway, what's coming up this week that we'll have is all the override votes on Tuesday. Senator Heiss had presided over the Senate scheduled session on Thursday and told another member of the press corps that it would be looking like override. Speaker Moore was there on Thursday and told reporters, like, yep, we're all doing it on Tuesday, and it'll be all day Tuesday afternoon. So if you're listening to this, Monday night or Tuesday morning and want to be there for the vote, you better hustle over. Tuesday morning is also Josh Stein, who is running for, he's a front runner for Democrats running for governor to replace Cooper. And Governor Cooper is going to be there too, and he's having a rally over at Shaw, which is just a couple blocks away. One last thing on redistricting I want to know, Tyler, before we move on to our headliners of the week. When you did the longtime listeners of the podcast may have listened to that special gerrymandering sort of mini series on the podcast, and you talked to a lot of different people about how everything came together. What from there that you learned are things we should be looking for as this process plays out this month?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has been really extraordinary about our understanding of how gerrymandering works at the end of the process, right? We know this is a black box in a lot of ways. It's going to return to a black box this year, most likely. But, is asking questions about, how do we actually define gerrymandering and how do we define what a fair map is? And this is a very subjective question that can be pretty tough to define, and even people who show up to these redistricting hearings have different ideas about what a fair map can be. But one of the things that sort of emerged in some of these court cases and lots of political science papers and even math papers is sort of a way for us to ask these questions and get some reasonable answers. And so one of the things, in addition to just seeing, what is the political skew of a given map, 10-4, 9-5, 7-7, whatever, that's an important question to sort of see what the political affiliation might end up being. But also there are some other related questions about how far those maps skew from what you would consider normal in North Carolina. So if you took thousands and thousands of options of maps and you saw how they performed, how much does the map that we're currently looking at differ from that norm? And those are questions that we can actually quantify a little better than we could a couple of years ago. And I think the other thing to watch very closely is specifically about how responsive are these maps. We can talk a lot about the importance of, from a political strategy of making a 10-4 map. But I think it's also important to note that what we've seen in recent years is that, people drawing maps also want to make sure that they keep power. no matter how the political winds shift. And that's very contrary to what a lot of voters would expect, right? And so also trying to ask some questions about not just how competitive these maps are, but really how responsive they are to the will of the voters. And that's the thing that, we're really going to try to dig into a little bit more so we can have a better understanding of what these maps mean for us as voters.
And that's a lot about congressional maps. I remember the other congressional freshman, it's Valerie Foushee. I covered her race, and it just slipped my mind at the time, and she was a state senator. So basically all these state senators were like, no, we want to go to Congress now. And maybe some people in the House want to go to Congress now, or some people are actually planning to run, even if more won't tell us if he's definitely running again. So speaking of Congress, let's move on to our picks for Headliner of the Week. My headliner is Patrick McHenry's gavel, who's the interim speaker after Speaker McCarthy was ousted. And you could tell that McHenry was not happy about it, and he gavelled out that session pretty, emphatically, I guess is what I would say. And like I was talking about earlier about how reporters had talked to Speaker Moore this week, it was a no-vote session in the House, but Moore was asked about what he thought about how it played out. So I've got a clip of his answer that I'll play for you about what he thinks about what's going on with the federal speaker, and here he is, our state speaker. So here's that Moore clip.
I think it was the wrong move. I think it was the wrong move because you had literally just a very small group of the caucus who had that objection. And frankly, I think the way the rule is structured is a problem. Here in ours, I think it's 2/3 to remove the speaker. So, and that's good. I mean, if you've done something where 2/3 want you gone, probably time to go, right? So, but that one where any member can make a motion and then a breakaway group can join with the other party, that just invites chaos.
All right, so let's move on to y'all's picks for headliner. Tyler, what is your headliner of the week?
I'd have to say e-courts. So listeners listening to this on Monday morning, today is going to be the big day for Mecklenburg County, which is launching a new electronic courts system. This has been a pretty rocky launch in the current counties that it's been launched in, at least since February: Wake, Harnett, Johnson, and Lee counties. Mecklenburg County is the busiest courthouse in the state, and we're really going to be watching closely how that courthouse, the clerks and the lawyers, the judges, and more importantly, the public is being impacted by this rollout.
So if you haven't read Tyler's work on e-courts on the News and Observer, you can do that at newsobserver.com. And I will say I was happy to note that during the skeletal session in the House, I believe it was Representative Joe John on his way out, he handed a print edition of the NNO to Moore and said he should read it. And it was about the e-courts. So Kyle, what is your headliner of the week?
My headliner is the Chapel Hill mayoral race. So I lived in Chapel Hill for 4 years when I was going to school there, and I think the politics are interesting there because obviously it's a very progressive liberal place. Most of the people elected in office share that ideology, but what has been sort of an undercurrent in the politics there and is really coming out now in the mayoral race is this divide in the town between pro-development and anti-development factions. And that is just coming together in a very nasty sparring way in this new mayoral race between, I believe, Jess Anderson and Adam Searing. So if listeners want to go take a look into some of the coverage regarding that, I think it's very spicy, very interesting.
Spicy. Yeah, you think Congress and the legislature is spicy? Like, check out some local council meetings sometime. So, all right, I'm Dawn Vaughan for Kyle Ingram and Tyler Dukes. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.